Canons. Your Eminences, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to thank, first of all, to the chairman of the Academy, of Dimitrias and Almiro, Ignatius. Many thanks to the director of the Academy, Mr. Pantelis Kalajidis, for the honorary invitation to participate with the following presentation during the Conference on Canonical Law. The sacred canons are the corpus of the life and the management of the Church. They are a pillar, together with the scriptures and the sacred tradition, on which the Church treaded. This is a reality. Of course, on the one hand, no other expression of the Church was more misunderstood than the canons in their application and interpretation within the Church. It is because of these misunderstandings of erroneous interpretations we have been led to misunderstand the very nature of holy canons, as the case was with the decision of the Council of the State, distinguish canons in administrative and theological ones. Erroneous interpretations led the Church into various adventures. All this means that erroneous interpretations of the very nature of the canons leads to problems. This misinterpretation endangered, occasionally, the very identity of the Orthodox Church. Contrary to the above, holy canons cannot be understood and interpreted without reference to ecclesiology, namely the very principles that delimitate the use and interpretation of the holy canons, given that the canons, as ecclesiastical texts, describe the function of the Church's structures. In other words, these are the structures through which the Church expresses itself before the people. Therefore, any division between dogma and sacred rules, dogma of truth and ecclesiastical structures, is unacceptable and dangerous, both for the character of the sacred rules, but also to the function of the ecclesiastical, the Church's structures. This relation is confirmed by historical development and the shaping of the very Church structures by relating their operation, their function, with the canonical tradition. This interpretation, this relevance and context presupposes the understanding of this reality by the Church, in order to protect the Church from any alienation or misinterpretation of a secular type. So any study, any attempt to understand the canonical tradition presupposes reference to the historical references, and of course it requires an ecclesial interpretation. With this dual method, we can attempt to understand the canonical tradition in order to reflect the living experience of the body of the Church. At the same time, we can render the holy canons milestones showing the way forward when we have to deal with challenges of modern times. In addition, in this effort, we should not ignore the fact that as any Holy Scripture, the patristic text, etc., are not identical to the very nature of the Church. They are not the identity of the Church. They simply reflect the experience of truth as an ecclesial event. Canons give meaning to the structures of the Church as ways and means for the reflection of the identity of the Church. A typical example of this function of holy canons is the reference in Canon 34, Apostolic Canon 34, where the function of the Holy Synod, for example, not only is founded on the doctrinal truth of the Church, but it shows to the body of the Church the fundamental event of the communion in relation with the mystery of the Holy Trinity. For this reason, canons are not a stand-alone, self-sufficient juridical text. They are organically part of the life and the tradition of the Church, while the constitution is based on the Scriptures, directly or indirectly, and the Holy Tradition, and not on secular juridical texts. The Holy Canons are needed in the life of the Church, but they do not substitute themselves in the truth of the Church. Any notion of quote-unquote law cannot claim canonicity if it is not linked more deeply with the truth of the Church. That is why Holy Canons as an ecclesial text must be linked or refer to the doctrinal truth of the Church. So it is in the Church's reality that we find the substantive, deep relation between dogma and canons. This is sine qua non. At the same time, it is the interpretational basis of the texts, as His Old Holiness says, intra and dextra. In order to understand this proper consideration and interpretation of the canonical tradition in the context of ecclesiality, we need to clarify the following. Against what I just mentioned, I think it becomes clear that there is a clear relation between the content and the character of the canonical tradition, close and linked to the Church itself. Because of this relation, canons are not juridical texts, of course, while at the same time we do not run the risk of indulging in juridical interpretations which would solely attempt to find solutions for modern challenges. So the purpose of the whole thing is the pastoring of the body of the Church. This ecclesial interpretation and consideration of canons means that each canon cannot be interpreted independently of the nature of the Church. Its interpretation must always be founded on the constitutional principles of ecclesiology, otherwise we run the risk of being led to a unilateral and erroneous implementation thereof, far from the genuine spirit of the canon. The sacramental experience of the Church and the Eucharistic-centered identity, in accordance with St. Nicholas Cavasilas, leads to the Eucharistic character of the canons, and at the same time makes it necessary to refer them to our religion, to the fundamental principle of their existence and operation within the mystery itself of the Church. Given that on the axis of Eucharist, we concentrate the Eucharistic experience and we show the mystery of the Church in any time and geography. So we safeguard the genuine intent of rules, always related to the operation, the function of the Church. This Eucharistic and ecclesial character of holy canons is confirmed, for example, by the character of all ecclesial penances that are meant to awaken the faithful and lead to repentance, so that the faithful can become once again a healthy, clean member of the body of the Church and able to partake of Eucharist, of the Holy Sacraments. Canons also serve the synodical function. as we know in the 4th century, the term council, synodos in Greek, means the Eucharist and the Church itself. That is why there's no Holy Canon which does not include either positive or negative implications or references, respectively, with respect to the Eucharist. The Eucharistic and ecclesial character of the content and the interpretation of Holy Canons is first related to the very role and the functions of the bishop, who is more than the mere center and head of the diocese. He's in charge of the observance of Holy Canons in his jurisdiction as part of the synodical function. He's also the link of the local church with the other churches. Only in this way the bishop can interpret and implement, mutatis mutandis, the canonical tradition, because the synodical function is related directly to the Eucharistic communion. The churches communicate through the bishops and with the head of all churches, who is the sine qua non for the canonicity of the synodical institution, bestowing validity to the decisions of the bishops. If this way to maintain canonicity is the synodical institution, which from the first years maintained the ecclesial community and solved problems tormenting our society, then this very way of expressing the Eucharistic communion is the sine qua non for implementing Holy Canons. Let us see some elements of the canonical tradition which confirm what I've just maintained. The synodical struggle, as described in the history of our Church, for maintaining unity and the expression of the Eucharistic communion, was an effort not just to word dogmatic truth, but also to define criteria pertaining to the distinction between heresies, schism, and orthodoxy. Those who did not obey the bishops are those who differentiated themselves from the Eucharistic community and disrupt the union of the local church. That is why they are excommunicated or schismatic, because they have adopted a different way of life compared to the life of the church. The stance, positive or negative, and the acceptance of the opinion of the bishop and the recognition of his contribution or not in the maintaining of the communion with the local community constitutes the dividing line and the difference between canonicity and non-canonicity, unity or division, communion or excommunication. These distinctions, this dividing line between heresy and orthodoxy through the canonical tradition, are totally different compared to those that are widely adopted today. In accordance with the canonical tradition, heretics, in accordance with the modern concept, heretics are erroneously characterized only those who express a different opinion or interpretation of the truth of the Church, while we tend to ignore the denial of the life of the Church, the truth and the love of the communion. This practical denial confirms that for the Church itself, heresies or orthodoxy are not simply theoretical concepts or views. We're talking about an attitude, a stance in life. Orthodoxy is not simply the insistence on the truth of various theoretical maxims. It is the participation, the acceptance of the truth of the Church as a fact, as an event of communion with the bishop, with the Eucharist in the epicenter. Because of this very concept, heretics, in accordance with Canon 6 of the Second Ecumenical Council, are not those who authoritatively are characterized by some groups as a heretic, or those who simply use rich theological expressions or wordings, but the person who was excommunicated by the Church, who was anathematized by the Synod and by the canonical bishops, and who, at the same time, with his stance and attitude, distorts canonicity through mainly by not mentioning the bishop with the argument that he is ostensibly heretic, without, of course, this being endorsed by the Synod. This distinction, this dividing line, this characteristic of the heretic is described by Kyrillus of Alexandria. The Holy Father says that heretic is not who, in writing or orally, expresses views that are not necessarily in full harmony or contradict what the Church teaches. It's who willingly, conscientiously, on purpose, distorts the beliefs of the Church and publicly teaches against the beliefs of the Church. And when he's invited to provide an explanation, he does not show up or insists on his erroneous teaching. That's why the heretic for our Church is totally unreliable, because whatever he preaches is the expression of his distance from the Church, of the Catholic Church. And he tries to break up the unity of the Church and taking distance from the Eucharistic community. The wealth of theological references do not, fortunately, impinge on the truth of the teaching of the Church. On the contrary, the variety is most welcome. However, this different stance vis-à-vis our Church is exactly and precisely the heretic attitude, because it has different salutary implications in the form of the denial of the Church per se, according to Chrysostom. With this stance and attitude, the Catholic Church delimitates its boundaries, and at the same time it expresses at the specific time and place that those who come to orthodoxy, even heretics before, can be admitted according to Rule 7 of the Second Council. This practice varies, of course, through the ages and in the Orthodox tradition, concerning, that is, the ways of accepting the heterodox or the heretic in our Church. Let me give you an example. When the Fathers of the Fourth Council declared that a simple denial of the heresy can make one Orthodox and that no baptism or reordination is required, that did not, of course, equate to the recognition of the baptism or the mysteries carried out by the heretics, as erroneously is pretended by various quarters. The acceptance of heretics by economy does not mean automatically the acceptance of contacts in mysteries with the heretic. In light of this brief introduction, I believe it is at least necessary for the Orthodox Church to think again in a flexible manner all these aspects of the ecclesial use of the tradition. We have to rethink all these theological elements pertaining to the Holy Canons, in the sense that Holy Canons express the theology of our Church. They set the conditions of the function of the Church's structures, the ways of maintaining communion in the Church, and are not just juridical or legal texts or simple decisions, but milestones for the very ecclesial life and reality. The problem today concerning the use of canonical tradition is not the dilemma of whether we should introduce new canons or revisit older ones. It is about, though, implementing new criteria of which the reliability cannot be questioned, in order to launch a new dynamic, so that by implementing them mutatis mutandis, we can resolve modern ecclesial and anthropological problems. Thank you.